Two cops thought they'd caught an easy target. What they didn't know was that he ran the entire department. The sound of tires crunching against gravel filled the quiet evening air as Julian Coleman, a 48-year-old man known for his calm demeanor and strong leadership, turned onto Sycamore Avenue. He was heading home after a long but fulfilling day spent meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina. His car, a modest black sedan, blended into the suburban streets. His mind drifted to thoughts of his wife's famous pot roast waiting at home, a well-earned comfort after a day of service. Then blue and red lights flared in his rearview mirror, slicing through the night like an alarm bell. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a brief moment. A quick glance at the speedometer, 29 in a 35. No traffic violations, no broken taillights. Yet the patrol car's siren wailed, commanding him to pull over. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself as he flicked on his turn signal and eased the car to a stop at the side of the road. He knew the routine. Hands visible, movements slow, demeanor polite. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because in these moments, appearances could mean everything. A flashlight beam cut through the dimly lit interior of Julian's car as the first officer approached his window, his steps brisk, his stance assertive. Another officer lingered near the rear bumper, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" the first officer barked, suspicion dripping from his tone. Julian met his gaze, his voice steady and composed. "No, sir," he responded evenly. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight swept over Julian's face, lingering just a second too long before darting down to his lap, his console, and then back to his eyes. "License and registration," he ordered, ignoring Julian's response. Julian moved carefully, his voice steady as he narrated each motion. "I'm getting my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after this." The officer didn't respond, but Julian noticed the way his posture stiffened. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't expecting an answer. Before Julian could respond, the officer continued. "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the other lane." Julian frowned. "With respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. My dashcam can verify that." The officer's expression darkened. "Dashcam, huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Julian blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said step out of the vehicle, now." Julian's stomach churned, but he kept his composure. He unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door, raising his hands in clear view. The second officer moved in swiftly, grabbing Julian's arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" Julian asked, his voice measured but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." The cold bite of handcuffs clamped around Julian's wrists. His mind raced. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was profiling, plain and simple. As the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, Julian caught movement from the corner of his eye. Down the street, a few neighbors peered through their curtains, their faces barely visible in the dim glow of porch lights. Someone was watching. Through the slats of their blinds, silhouettes hovered, illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights. No one stepped outside, no one intervened. But this was far from over. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested, and Julian wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The patrol car rattled slightly as it rolled down the street, the faint hum of the tires blending into the quiet night. Julian sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists still stinging from the too tight cuffs. He glanced out the window, watching familiar landmarks blur past. But his mind wasn't on the scenery. Instead, he was trying to process the absurdity of what had just happened. Up front, the two officers chatted casually, their tone light, like they hadn't just handcuffed and detained a man without cause. The younger one, Officer Daniels, glanced at Julian through the rearview mirror, smirking. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run, or you just like giving us a hard time?" Julian met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." Daniels let out a short laugh. "Yeah, sure." The other officer, a stocky man named Reed, snorted. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Julian bit his tongue. Arguing now wouldn't help. Instead, he took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew his rights. He also knew the system, and Julian knew the odds weren't in his favor. When they arrived at the precinct, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh, sterile glare over the holding area. The atmosphere was cold, impersonal, just like the system that had led him here. Daniels removed Julian's cuffs with an almost theatrical flourish. "Welcome to our humble abode," he said with a smirk. "You're going to be here for a while." Julian rubbed his wrists, his expression calm. "Am I being charged?" Reed chuckled. "We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit tight." The heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, the sound lingering in the air like a final warning. The holding cell was small and frigid, the kind of place meant to break a man's spirit. Julian sat on the worn bench, his mind a storm of thoughts. He had spent years building a career rooted in justice and fairness. Yet here he was, on the wrong side of a system he had dedicated his life to reforming. Outside the cell, the two officers leaned against a desk, laughing quietly as they shuffled through Julian's paperwork. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels muttered, almost disappointed. "Doesn't matter," Reed replied, smirking. "We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." Julian overheard every word. His expression didn't change. His posture remained steady. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. And he knew. His patience would pay off soon. The hours dragged by. Other officers came and went, casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None of them seemed to recognize him, but Julian didn't expect them to. He was new to the area, having taken the position only 3 weeks prior. Finally, just as dawn began to streak the sky with soft orange hues, he heard footsteps approaching. A stern-looking officer appeared in front of the cell, her presence commanding instant attention. Her badge read, Lieutenant Morgan. She carried an air of authority and professionalism that immediately set her apart from the two officers who had brought him in. Morgan frowned as she glanced at Julian, then at the paperwork in her hand. "What's going on here?" Daniel stepped forward. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" Reed, still leaning lazily against the desk, shrugged. "We haven't processed it yet." Morgan's gaze sharpened as she turned back to Julian. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Julian stood, meeting her eyes with calm confidence. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events." Morgan's jaw tightened as she glanced back at the officers. "You didn't review his dash cam?" Reed shrugged again. "We didn't get to it yet." Morgan exhaled sharply, her displeasure evident. "Get it now. And Daniels, my office. Now." As the two officers slunk away, Julian could feel the shift. The tide was beginning to turn, but this was just the beginning of their reckoning. He leaned back against the cold metal bench, watching the precinct buzz with activity. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers or the distant hum of conversation. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer. Despite the stillness around him, Julian's mind was anything but calm. He replayed the night's events like a film reel, Every sharp word, every unnecessary escalation. It all served as a stark reminder of the deep flaws he had spent years fighting to fix. His new position as police chief had been an opportunity to address these issues from within, to create a culture of accountability. And now, here he was, experiencing the very injustice he had vowed to dismantle. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Lieutenant Morgan returned, a tablet in hand. She stopped in front of the cell and gestured for him to step closer to the bars. "We reviewed your dashcam footage," she said, her tone clipped but professional. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear, this should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely." Julian raised an eyebrow. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for this. "I'll be releasing you immediately," she continued, "but I'd like to discuss next steps privately." Minutes later, Julian was out of the cell, now seated across from Morgan in her office. The room was stark. Just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a small file cabinet. No frills, no distractions, just business. Morgan sat forward, folding her hands. "I'll be filing a report against Daniels and Reed," she began. Julian leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, because now it was his turn to set things right. Morgan placed her hands on the desk, hesitating for a brief moment. It was clear she was choosing her next words carefully. "There's something I need to ask." She studied Julian, her gaze sharp. "Who are you? Really? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell over nothing." Julian leaned back slightly, offering her a small, measured smile. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant," he said smoothly. "Let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm." Morgan held his gaze, searching for something beneath his steady demeanor. Then, with a small nod, she relented. "Fair enough," she said. "But I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation." A reckoning begins. As Julian stepped out of the precinct, the early morning sun warmed his face, but the weight of the night still clung to his shoulders. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, pulled into his reserved parking space, and walked through the doors of the police headquarters he now oversaw. Inside, his assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, startled. "Chief Coleman? You're here early." Julian gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "It's been a long night, Anita. Can you prepare a briefing room for me? I need to address the department this afternoon." Sensing the gravity in his voice, Anita nodded quickly. "Of course, Chief." Julian stepped into his office and closed the door behind him. For a moment, he exhaled deeply. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what his experience represented. The public trusted him to lead, to protect, and to hold others accountable. That responsibility weighed heavily. But Julian welcomed it. Still, before he could act, there was one more storm to weather. The courtroom where the truth would come to light. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case, and local media outlets were eager to cover it. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop reporters from crowding the courthouse steps, ready to pounce the moment the hearing adjourned. Inside, Julian sat quietly at the defendant's table, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his attorney, Sandra Reyes, flipped through a thick folder of evidence. Sandra was a force to be reckoned with, sharp, unrelenting, and known for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Across the room, Officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels looked nervous, his foot tapping uncontrollably beneath the table. Reed, on the other hand, wore a smug expression, leaning back in his chair as if he had nothing to worry about. Then the doors opened. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered, and took his seat. He adjusted his glasses before calling the session to order. We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Julian Coleman. His voice carried through the hushed courtroom. Prosecution, you may proceed. A young and somewhat hesitant prosecutor stood. Clearing his throat, he began to outline the case as it was initially reported. On the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by officers Daniels and Reed, he became uncooperative and... Sandra didn't even flinch. She simply waited, because soon enough, the real story would unfold. When the truth spoke for itself, Sandra barely suppressed a smile. She leaned over to Julian and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Sandra stood, confidence radiating from her. Her voice was clear, commanding the room. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but a direct result of racial profiling and an abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statements." The judge gave a curt nod. "Proceed." Sandra gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights. The screen flickered to life, and the dash cam footage began to play. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The video showed Julian's car moving steadily within his lane, the speedometer reading a constant 29 miles per hour. The patrol car tailing him suddenly turned on its lights, without cause. Then came the body cam footage. The courtroom watched as officers Daniels and Reed approached Julian's car, their aggressive tone clear from the first interaction. Then, an unmistakable exchange. Daniels muttered under his breath, "Another one of them causing trouble." Reed chuckled. "Figures." A ripple of gasps spread through the audience. The judge's brow furrowed as he glanced toward the officers, his expression unreadable, but his displeasure clear. Sandra paused the video, turning back to the courtroom. "This," she said, her voice sharp, "is the professionalism displayed by officers Daniels and Reed." She let the silence hang for a moment, then turned back to the screen. "Now let's fast forward to the arrest itself." The footage resumed, showing Julian complying fully, calmly narrating his movements as he retrieved his registration and license. The contrast was stark, his composure against their escalating hostility. And by the time the video ended, the tension in the room was palpable, because now the truth was undeniable, and justice was about to be served. As the video ended, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Sandra turned to the jury, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is not just an abuse of power. This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." Across the room, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, visibly flustered. "The officers believed they had probable cause," he argued weakly. Sandra didn't hesitate. She cut in sharply. "Probable cause? Based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps the color of his skin?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Counsel, let's keep this focused." Sandra nodded, her voice softening, but her words remained razor-sharp. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something to say." Julian stood, adjusting his tie. He took a slow breath, scanning the room, locking eyes with Daniels and Reed before turning toward the judge. "My name is Julian Coleman," he began, his voice calm but unshakable. "I am the chief of police for this city." A stunned silence fell over the room. "I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you have just witnessed." Gasps filled the air. "I chose not to disclose my position earlier," he continued, "because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias, without interference. And now, it has." The room erupted in murmurs. Daniels's face turned pale. Reed's smug expression melted away. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order in my courtroom." Julian's voice carried over the noise, clear and unwavering. "This is not just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels and Reed to operate unchecked. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As a police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness, and as a citizen, I'll continue to fight for justice." And in that moment, the tide shifted. Justice was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The media frenzy continued, but Julian didn't linger. He had more important matters to address. The fallout from the case was swift. Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the footage was released to the press, sparking protests and calls for reform. Community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and better training. Officers within the department took notice. Julian's leadership had taken on new significance. He called an emergency meeting, gathering officers in the precinct. Standing at the front of the room, he addressed them with unwavering conviction. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," Julian said, scanning the room. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, and as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent, his words cutting through any lingering doubt about his intentions. Over the following weeks, Julian implemented sweeping changes. Mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and an anonymous reporting system for officer misconduct were just the beginning. The community began to see a shift, though trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Months later, Julian sat on a panel at a town hall meeting, listening as a young man stood up to speak. "Chief Coleman," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "what you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Julian nodded, his heart heavy but full of resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but together we can build a system that truly serves everyone." As the town hall ended, Julian lingered for a moment, watching people file out with renewed hope. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready for it, and now it's up to us, the viewers and the community, to keep that fight alive. If we see injustice, we must speak up. If we want change, we must demand it. Together, we have the power to create a world where accountability isn't just a promise. It's a reality.